Hey guys, just want to give you a quick recap of what we talked about last week if you weren't here or want a quick recap, since we are talking about the story this year and we want to talk about the story all year. So it's important to know where we're at in this story. So we're in the book of Genesis, and Genesis is in two parts. So the first part is chapters 1 through 11, and the second part is chapters 12 through 50. So chapters 1 through 11 focuses on God and his interactions with the world, and chapters 12 through 50 focuses on the start of God's family, the start of God's people. So last week we talked about God's creation of the world in Genesis chapter 1 and 2, creation of the world and mankind. And in Genesis chapter 3, we start to see some shortcomings. In Genesis, really, chapter 3 through 11 is a lot of the times that God's people fall short. So we have the story of Adam and Eve in the garden, and we have the story of Cain and Abel, and we have the story of Lamech, and it eventually ends with the Tower of Babel. But what we're going to talk about today is the start to something awesome, God's family, specifically with Abraham.
So what we're going to be looking at tonight is Genesis 21 and 22, which is, let me give you a little bit, I don't need to do this, a little bit of background on Abraham, because we need to meet and know this guy before we see these narratives playing out. So Abraham is a guy that God identifies early on in his life as someone that he wants to partner with. One of the things I didn't bring up is all those other narratives leading up to that of Abraham is you see people that God is looking for a partner. He's looking for someone to work through, to help redeem the world, to make it right again the way it was supposed to be in the Garden of Eden. And he puts Adam on earth to be his agent to make things right, and Adam screws it up and brings sin into the world. And then God's looking for partners. He's looking for people to work with. He wants to work with Noah. And there's a lot of really good things that Noah does. And Noah helps save humanity from the flood by bringing his family onto the ark and all the animals and those things. But then there's just something about Noah that's a little bit too selfish, that's not quite right. And so God continues to work, and he continues to look, and he continues to look for a partner through which he's going to save the world. And in many ways, he finally finds that guy in Abraham, which is why Abraham ends up being the father of God's chosen people, Israel, who, by the way, a little bit of a preview. Israel is meant to be the priesthood, a nation of priests that point to God, that help everyone else know who God is. They're supposed to be priests to all the people, and that's why Israel is the chosen nation. They are the chosen people to be priests for the world. A little bit of it. And God says when he makes his covenant with Abraham, through you all people will be saved. That's something that God says directly to Abraham. But why is Abraham significant? Why is he pointed out? There's some different things about Abraham. For one, Abraham's a guy that listens to God. Early on in his life, Abraham is the firstborn, which is a really significant thing, especially in those cultures, because your role as a firstborn son, is to take over the family business and be the man in charge of the house. So that as long as your dad's alive, he's the important guy, but as soon as he passes away, it passes to the firstborn son, and he becomes the most important person. So Abraham had all these responsibilities growing up that he's supposed to be the patriarch of the family, the guy who takes over everything. And God says, I want you to move away from your family and go somewhere else because I've got a different plan for you. And Abraham follows, even though culturally, he's abandoning his family essentially when he makes that decision to move because God said to move. There's a lot of things that Abraham disrupts because he decides it's more important to follow God than to follow my culture and what I've been trained to do. So that's one little thing about Abraham. Another little thing about Abraham is who he chooses to marry. He marries Sarah. Depending on how you read this, Abraham's actually a little bit later in life when he gets married. He's maybe like 40, maybe older than that. So if there's any of you that are freaking out right now because you have no prospects or hope of getting married, like you got time, it's fine, it's okay, Aaron. You can do the Abraham thing. The thing about it though is, so Sarah, she's part of the family. They're actually pretty close relations to Abraham. I know that seems icky to us, like cousins and half siblings marrying and stuff like that. Just know that it happened a lot more back then in those cultures, and they were cool with it. Didn't have the stigma that it has today. So just kind of throw that out of your head for a while. Don't worry about it. Just know that it happens. Okay, cool. We're all past that now? Good. Okay, so Sarah's a relatively close relation of Abraham, and her dad dies, and her sisters are unmarried. And so there's basically no one to provide for them, no one to protect them. They're hoes because their inheritance doesn't pass to women. I know it's bad culture. They don't care about women at all. Ancient culture. Another thing that we just kind of have to move on. That's how it is. Okay, we're past that now too. Cool. All right. So they need to find husbands, otherwise they're dead basically, because no one's providing for them, no one's caring about them. And so usually a close member of the family will volunteer to marry the women. Again, not a great. It's a good tradition because it provides for people and it helps people to survive. It looks bad to us because it's just arranged forced marriage and who wants to do that? Who wants that to be their life? But it's okay. We'll get past that too. Okay, moving on. Breaking down all kinds of cultural boundaries and ignoring what the ancients did and how we view. Okay, moving on. So Sarah is roughly the same age as Abraham at this point in time. She's unmarried, which is really weird in that culture because you get married when you're 12 if you're a woman. Because as soon as you can make babies, you're married worthy and those kind of things happen. Likely, Sarah didn't get married because everyone already knew that she was barren. Because that thing that's supposed to happen when she's 12 or 13 as a developing woman never happened for Sarah. And probably never Sarai, sorry. She becomes Sarah later. Her name's still Sarai at this point. Very confusing. Sarai, likely everyone would have known that she had no chance of having kids because her body doesn't work the right way. For those of you who know, there's ways you can tell that. If you don't know, I'm not explaining it tonight. Okay, cool. Aaron, stop. Okay. So if everybody knows she's barren, that's why she's not married, because you kind of want to have kids. It's how you send the family line, it's how you get your heirs, it's how everything happens. It's the way things are supposed to happen. You're supposed to have kids. So being a barren woman basically says no one wants to marry you. Nobody wants to. Except for those creepy people who are going to try to make you a sex slave at some point in time. Yeah, that also happens in ancient culture, and it's bad. And it shouldn't realize it was bad back then. Anyway, wow, I'm getting so off topic. Sarai is barren. Abraham as firstborn. This is when he's still part of his family. He has picked the litter. He's the guy who gets to choose whoever he wants to marry. They've decided they're going to help their family out, which is an honorable thing to do in their culture. But he says, I'm going to marry Sarai because she's the oldest, she's the firstborn, she's the one who's supposed to be married. And probably everybody around him are actually going to look at it and go, dude, you know Sarai's barren, right? You got no chance of having kids. And Abraham says, I don't care. She's supposed to be provided for. She's supposed to be protected. Even if this means I'm ending my family line, this is who I'm going to marry. And I think that's those reasons are why God says Abraham is someone I can partner with. Because this is someone who cares about people. This is someone who self-sacrifices. This is someone who says, even if it means my line, my inheritance is shot, it's still more important to take care of someone else first. This is Abraham. He's this dude of super hospitality. There's the story of when the angels show up to Abraham, and they just kind of wander in, and Abraham's let me go feed you, and he runs back, which if you know anything about Middle Eastern cultures, men, especially important men of the household, never run for any reason whatsoever. Abraham runs back home and says, we're going to make a ton of bread for these guests that showed up. And he says we're going to make 7 seahs of flour, which by roughly modern math is 60 pounds of flour, which makes an insane amount of bread. More bread than those people could probably eat for several months. But Abraham says, this is how we care for strangers. This is how hospitable we are. And it happens to be that God has shown up to talk to Abraham. And there's the whole Sodom and Gomorrah thing, and there's a lot of other details and narratives that we're not going to cover tonight, because we're finally getting to the story that we are going to cover. Because the thing about Abraham is God makes a covenant with him. He makes a promise with him where he says, I'm going to save the world through you and your line. And I'm going to give you a kid. Even though at this point in time, Abraham's 99 years old. He says, I'm going to give you a kid. You don't know what that looks like. You don't know what that means. I'm going to give you a kid. But then it gets screwy because humans always have this idea of, okay, we know what God's plan is, but we can figure out our own way to do it that makes sense to us. And so Sarah actually gives her servant girl, Hagar, to Abraham. And then Abraham sleeps with her and then has a kid named Ishmael. So this first narrative we're going to look at is what happens with Ishmael. And there's a reason why we're doing this, and we'll get into it as we go along. But first, let's read a little bit about Ishmael. About 13 years after having Ishmael, he has Isaac. And so as soon as Isaac shows up on the scene, things get even more complicated than they already were. So the child groom was weaned. That refers to Isaac there. So on the day Isaac was weaned, Abraham held a great feast. But Sarah saw that the son whom Hagar the Egyptian had born to Abraham was mocking. And she said to Abraham, "Get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac." If you guys know anything about love triangles and kids, that's just messy and gross. Just have to see a couple soap operas to understand that. It gets all kinds of right away. So Sarah says, "No, I've got a kid now. I've finally proven my worth to the world. My kid's the only kid that matters, so get that woman and her son out of here." The matter distressed Abraham greatly because it concerned his son. But God said, "Well, do not be so distressed about the boy and your slave woman. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it's through Isaac that your offspring will be mighty. I will make the son of the slave into a nation also, because he is your offspring." I'll admit here that what God says isn't an easy thing to hear. God says there's this messy, weird love triangle, and we're going to just sweep away the messy weirdness and stick with my original plan. I have a hard time justifying that or saying that, but I think there's some ways you can get into the text, and I don't think God is being terrible here, and I think it's important to note that God says, "I'm going to take care of your son. I'm going to care for your people." So early the next morning, Abraham took some food and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar. He set them on her shoulders, and they sent her off with the boy. She went on her way and wandered in the desert of Beersheba. But when the water in the sea was gone, she put the boy under one of the bushes. And then she went off and sat down about a bow shot away, for she thought, "I cannot watch the boy die." And as she sat there, she began to sob. Next slide, the rest of the story. God heard the boy crying. God heard the boy crying. And the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What is the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Lift the boy up and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation." And then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. So she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy as he grew up. He lived in the desert and became an archer. And while he was living in the desert of Paran, his mother got a wife for him from Egypt. I'll explain that a little bit at the end later on. So there's a pretty big problem in this story. And maybe there's a couple problems that you see, but the biggest one that I see is with Hagar. She's distressed, and they've run out of water, and they're in the desert, and that's not a good combination. But what Hagar does is something that I'm not sure, as a parent myself, I'm not sure a mother would do, and that's just put your kid under a bush and walk away so that you don't have to witness your child die. This is a tough thing to think about. But if I'm in that situation, I'm holding and comforting my child to the bitter end. But that's not what Hagar does here. She puts him down under a bush and she walks away. Now, there's another issue with this story that's a little funky and a little weird. You may have heard me say that 13 years after Ishmael is born is when Isaac is born. And according to the beginning of the story, this is happening because Isaac shows up on the scene, which means Ishmael is a 13-year-old kid. And yet when it's all being described, when it's all going down, it sounds like it's like a baby. Or, somebody that you're carrying and you lay under a bush. Because a 13-year-old you don't put under a bush. Because as soon as you start walking away, he goes, "Mom, what are you doing?" And then runs after you and just "What the heck?" You're just putting me under a bush? It's a 13-year-old. He's practically a man in their culture. Or maybe it is. Yeah. But anyway, the timing of it is weird. And I think the reason that the timing is messed up is because maybe this doesn't actually happen when Ishmael is 13 years old. Maybe this happens when Ishmael is younger. I think what happened is when they're putting the narratives of Genesis together, they had this story, and they had this next story about Isaac that happens when Isaac is 13 years old. And they said, we need to put these next to each other. And so sometimes in the Bible and in other pieces of ancient literature, the point that they're trying to make, they don't care about chronology. They don't care about it all happening in order. They want to make it a bigger point. And so they'll put stories next to each other so you can compare them directly and say, oh, wait a second, like there's something going on here. And so there's a couple phrases that I highlighted in Genesis 21, which will then pop out in Genesis 22, including that 22 to 34 and Beersheba part. So let's look at Genesis 22. Sometime later, so this is the next story has been inserted next to this other story about Ishmael. This story about Isaac shows up in Genesis 22. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham, here I am, he replied. Then God said, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. Little pause. Abraham says nothing here when God says sacrifice your son. So a point I brought up when I was talking about the Noah story is the familiarity they have with other ancient cultures and the way they do things, and just how much the appeasement of gods and those kind of things tie in together. Nearly every single other religion around Abraham at this point in time is a child sacrifice-based religion. That's how you appease the gods. That's how you get the rains to come so that your crops will grow. You give back your child to the gods. You sacrifice and kill your kid. And so when Abraham hears this, he says, well, that's what everybody else's gods do, so I guess that's what my God's going to ask for too. Which is interesting because Abraham spent some time with God. He's developed a relationship with him. At this point in time, he should know that God is different than all the rest of those gods that people around him worship. But still, Abraham goes, oh, well, I guess this was coming. Now, there's some indications that he has this different type of faith. When he heads off in the mountain, he tells his servant that, like, we're going to come back. Both of us are going to come back. And that's in verse 5, so let's just read the text. Early the next morning, it's a phrase that showed up in the previous story, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. And when he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. Now on the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. And he said to his servant, stay here with the donkey while I go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. So Abraham knows that God has told him to sacrifice his son, and that's what he's expecting to do when he goes to worship. And yet he tells the servants, we will come back to you. Now, it could be he's trying to just keep up a straight face for Isaac, because, like I said, Isaac here's 13. Kid could just run off because he hears that dad's going to kill him. I think that Abraham knows that this God is different, and something different is going to happen. But he still believes that I'm supposed to follow what this God says. So there's some interesting twists that are happening within this story already. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac. He places the supplies here that he needs to worship on his son Isaac. In Hagar's story, Abraham takes the supplies, the water skin, and places it on Hagar. We've got some of the same verbiage going on between these 2 stories. That's how they parallel. So, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, Father? Yes, my son, Abraham replied. The fire and wood are here, Isaac said, but where is the land for the burnt offering? And Abraham answered, God himself will provide the land for the burnt offering, your son. And the 2 of them went on together. That phrase in verse 8, God himself will provide the land for the burnt offering, my son. Hebrew doesn't have punctuation. That comma's been added in later as an assumption as to what this is saying. It's very possible, and you can interpret this way from the original Hebrew, that Abraham has said, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, which is my son. So in that moment, it's possible that Abraham has finally admitted to Isaac that he is the sacrifice. So if you want to know a tough thing that's been going on. By the way, earlier it said they took 3 days to make the travel from the desert of Beersheba to the mountain that they were going to. By walking, that's a half a day journey. And they take it for 3 days. There's some who speculate that essentially Abraham goes the long way around the Dead Sea because he doesn't want to face this result. He's taking his time. And as they're journeying up the mountain, the last thing he wants to talk about is the sacrifice. Because it's his son. It's his only son. At this point, his only son because his other son is alive. And yet, Isaac asks, what's the deal? Where's the lamb? When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Again, more parallelism. Hagar places Ishmael underneath a bush, underneath wood. And here Abraham places his son Isaac on top of the wood. So, some ways that they compare to each other. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. When Hagar is at her point of giving up, there's an angel that calls out from heaven and informs her. Here, the angel calls out from heaven and calls upon Abraham. Here I am, he replied. Do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram. When Hagar is called upon, she looks up and she sees a well, the thing that is able to save her and her son. Abraham here looks up and he sees a ram, the sacrifice that takes the place of his son, that saves his son, the ram. How by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place the Lord will provide, or a better translation from Hebrew, the Lord who sees. And to this day he said, on the mountain of the Lord he provided. The angel of the Lord called Abraham from heaven a second time and said, I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring, all nations on earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed me. Then Abraham returned to his servants, and they set off together to Beersheba. And Abraham stayed in Beersheba. As I had that little note at the end, immediately following the story of Hagar and Ishmael, there's a covenant that's made, and they call that place Beersheba. And here, there's a covenant that is made, and then they head on to Beersheba. So again, just another place where there's parallelism. So we've done a little bit of literary analysis last week, and we're going to do a little bit more tonight. Because whenever you start to see parallelism, whenever you start to see stuff mesh up, it tells you to look closer. And there might even be more going on. Because what happens is within the tale of Abraham and Isaac, there's a chiasm. I taught you guys about chiasms last week, and I probably said it all really poorly. But essentially, it's that reflective thing where the first half of the passage mirrors the second half of the passage, and then those are bookends that point towards the middle. And in the middle is the treasure. The middle is where you're supposed to dig. It's this gigantic treasure map that has this X that tells you where to dig. It's where everything intersects in the middle. So hopefully this will start to make sense as we look at this next slide. We've got bookends here, and as we move to the center, you see where they mirror. So the first key is the phrase, here I am, that happens. It happens in verse 1, and it happens again in verse 11. I've cut out some of the fact here to make it a little bit more clear and for it all to just be nicely on one slide. So that was actually verse 1. That's the first here I am. Verse 11 is the other here I am. So those are initial bookends. Then you've got Abraham taking the wood for the burnt offering and placing it upon his son Isaac. Later on in the story, that's reflected by the fact that he binds up his son Isaac and places him on top of the wood. So again, similar things that are happening. And then we have the phrase went on together. And again, in verse 8, went on together. So those are kind of your three keys that are saying this is a chiasm here. There's some things going on here literally. And so when you break down the Hebrew, the phrase that shows up right in the middle is when Isaac asks his dad, what the heck's going on? And Abraham replies, yes, my son. That's the center of this chiasm. And sadly, the NIV translation here doesn't do it justice. Because there's actually one word that's there, and it's, this is the Hebrew pronunciation, I wrote it down phonetically. Haduni. And that word has actually appeared already in this passage 2 other times. It's just those 2 other times it was translated, here I am. And so all of this is happening, and Isaac speaks up and probably says the last word that Abraham wants to hear here, which is, Daddy, what's going on? And Abraham's response is, Hanuni, here I am. The reason I think this story is, I'm sorry, I'm a dad, so I'm getting emotional in this part right now. The reason I think this story is next to the story of Hagar and Ishmael is because in that moment, Hagar put her son under a bush and walked away. And in this moment, I've gotten so emotional since I've had kids, and now like this stuff. Okay, in this moment, Abraham as a dad is facing the idea of sacrificing his own son. And his son says, Dad? And Abraham says, here I am. You may not even know it yet. You may not even understand what's going on, but this is maybe the toughest moment of your life. Because you're going to hear from my mouth that I'm making you a sacrifice. But I am here. I am here for you. And the thing about this Hebrew word is there's other places where it shows up in Scripture. In fact, there's this tale with Moses where he comes upon this burning bush. And God uses this phrase to identify himself. He says, I am. Hanuni, here I am. And the thing is, it's in this period in time in Israel's history where they haven't heard from God, where they've been slaves in Egypt for 400 years, and they believe their God has abandoned them. And the first time he shows up, he says, no, here I am. I have always been here in your toughest trials, in the most difficult thing you've ever been through. When it looked like when it looked like Abraham was going to have to sacrifice his son, Abraham said, here am I. God says, in the middle of all this, in the middle of these trials, these difficulties, when you don't see a way out, when you've been in slavery for 400 years, I have always been here. Here I am. I always was, I always am, I always will be, and I will always be with you. Hanuni. This word shows up another time with Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, facing one of the most difficult times in his own life, as he's very directly confronted with the fact that he's going to die for humanity, for their sins. He's already cried out in the garden and made that decision, God, whatever your will be done. And then one of his best friends, one of his 12 good buddies, comes up and is going to betray him. And they're about to identify who Jesus is. And Jesus says, here I am. Hanuni. I'm the God. I'm the sacrifice. And it's cool because there's this powerful moment where the soldiers actually get knocked over when Jesus declares that word. This is all pointing together. Jesus is saying, I'm that ram that got caught in the thicket so that there isn't sacrifices that shouldn't be done, that no one wants to be done. There isn't to be child sacrifice. There isn't to be someone else killed on your behalf. I am the ram. It's cool the way that God has used this phrase as a reminder that he is with us. that he is present, that he cares about us, that he loves us, that he is different than any other gods that have come before, that any other culture has heard of, because they ask for things like child sacrifice. They ask for things that puts it all on our shoulders. And God says, no, it's on me. I'm the one who provides the sacrifice. And not only that, but I provide myself as the sacrifice. And that's our God. And this is our story.